The Old Testament figure, Job, brings to mind, and even perhaps even before his time, on the question of why righteous people suffer. Why do they go through, and why do these things happen to people who serve the Lord? And as I was thinking about that, we know that all the mess that the world is in is because of the fall. I mean, all of creation is suffering because of the fall. But when you see Job's life, in his case, and all the suffering that he went through, if I can do this, I think I'm wiggling a little there. It's good exercise, though. When we see the issue of what happened with Job, that it gave evidence that his faith was real. It was genuine. He believed, he trusted God. And in Job's situation, when it was all said and done, God was honored and Job was blessed. I mean, he was blessed abundantly. The church that we want to take a look at this morning for a few moments is the church of Smyrna. And we see that this particular church stood strong in the midst of extreme persecution. When we talked about Ephesus a couple of weeks ago, we said that Ephesus, this church there in Revelation chapter 2, as John is writing to them, lost their why. They forgot why they were doing what they were doing. The reason that they worked so hard, the reason why they wanted to make sure that they had everything correct according to truth. But they messed up. They left their first love. I call them correct but cold, and what a tragedy. And if there was a verse or a takeaway from Ephesus, it would be this, from Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Above all else, guard your heart. They didn't do that. And we understand that when Jesus was asked, and we know even from the Old Testament that the greatest commandment, the first part of the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, according to Matthew 12 and 30. We love the Lord of the ministry and then the ministry of the Lord. We love him first. It's out of the love that we have for the Lord. Of all the churches, Smyrna and the church at Philadelphia in Revelation were different. The rest of them, the other 5, received correction, but not them. And my statement for the Smyrna church is they were persecuted, but they were pure. Proverbs 24:10 says it like this: if you faint in the day of adversity or in the day of trouble, your strength is small. The Smyrna church was strong. They stood the test. Now, John is not writing the book of Revelation from a Holiday Inn on an island out there in the sea. He is writing it from a prison, a colony prison, where basically people either lost their mind or died physically from overwork. That's where John is. He is the last of the disciples. He had walked with Jesus, been with him, had pastored the church at Ephesus, had been a leader in that whole area. But because of his faith, because of his commitment to Christ, in fact, it says there in chapter 1 that because of the word of the Lord and because of the testimony of Christ, he was placed on that island and was banished there for the rest of their life. But like John, all the churches were suffering levels of persecution that he writes to there, but Smyrna they got it the worst. They seemed to be the church that was being extremely persecuted for their stand with Christ. As we will look at these other churches in some weeks to come, you'll notice that these other churches, there was some element of compromise. I would state, and we'll do this in a couple weeks, I believe that the challenge for us in America, and especially, and I would even say the Assemblies of God, is that we could be like the Thyatira church. And the challenge that is there, that we love the Lord, but there's a tendency in us to compromise. And there's a challenge, and God is calling us to, and I think there are events that are causing us to have to stand up for what we believe. And I only know and assume and know and acknowledge that it's happening even as we sit here this morning. Peter talked about suffering and persecution. And I like the way that he sums it up. He talked about it in chapter 2 of 1 Peter 3, 4. But in chapter 5 of 1 Peter, this is what he says. 1 Peter 5, 10 and 11. And the God of all grace. We could just stop there and I could talk about this for a little while. The God of all grace. How much grace do you need? I need a lot. Well, how much? Just tell me how much. Because God is the God of what? All grace. So if you need, however much you need, he's got it all. He's got it all. You need a room full, he'll give you a room full if you need it. Who called you to his eternal glory in Christ. Watch this. After you've suffered a little while, will he himself restore you? And what will happen as a result of suffering for Jesus? It will make you strong, firm, steadfast. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen. Now, I've often thought that, if I want to suffer, if I can plan my suffering, I'm thinking, when I'm in my late 80s, on a Friday afternoon from about 3 to 4, that's when all the suffering I'll ever experience will take place, and then I'll just go on from there. It doesn't work like that. You know that. And some of you, even here this morning, have suffered in different ways. And some of you even know what the persecution is like that's going on in our world. And before this morning is over, we want to pause and pray for those of you that may be in positions, whether it's at school or whether it's at home. I have dealt with primarily, mostly wives whose husband wants nothing to do with Jesus, and they suffer so much because of their trust. We've had women who attend our church that would give, but they did not want even to be recognized because it was some money that they had. And if their husband knew that they even thought about giving to God, it would cause them tremendous problems. And of course, we would never say anything, concerning that. But that exists. That exists in the world in which we live, and in our own church we have dealt with that and have talked to people about it. But what's interesting is you study church history, that persecution, instead of destroying the church, actually makes it stronger. It has a strengthening effect upon it. Smyrna was surrounded by people who were anti-God, anti-Christ, anti-gospel, anti-things that were good for their society. That's where they were. And instead of them receiving any correction or criticism from the Lord, as the other churches got corrected, only comfort and encouragement, because they were standing strong. It was required in the Roman Empire, and especially in Smyrna and in these other churches, that once a year, everybody in the Empire of Rome had to offer incense to Caesar. Everybody had to do it once a year. And when you did it, you got a certificate that you gave incense to Caesar. If you didn't, it could be fatal. And these Christians in Smyrna and these other churches tried to lay low, stay under the radar so that they wouldn't be known. The sad thing is that there were Jews that were so anti the church that they would tell the Roman officials that those people have not done that, and as a result, they would be persecuted and even lose their life as such. They didn't get the certificate. They didn't declare Caesar as Lord because they know that Jesus is Lord, and that's the way that it's supposed to be. But a little bit about this city of Smyrna. Smyrna comes from the word myrrh. Myrrh, and we remember that from Christmas. All right, gold, frankincense, and myrrh were given. It is a wonderful fragrance that came from a thorny tree. And they would crush the tree, and they would get this ointment out of the tree, and it smelled beautiful and really was a valuable asset. And Smyrna had the corner on the market. Rome allowed them to really control the sale and the benefit of having Smyrna, and they shipped it all over the known world at that time because it was very valuable. You know, that's how they anointed bodies for burial, especially Jewish people anointed bodies for burial, and there were no such things as we are aware of, and it's common today. But this city of Smyrna was considered the crown of Asia Minor, a very important city. About 600 years before Christ, the city was destroyed, and then Alexander the Great came along and he rebuilt the city. And there was this mantra that we are told that Smyrna they believed that they died and rose again, that they were dead and now they are alive. And when Jesus is introducing himself to this church in Revelation 8, he uses that phrase that I am he who is dead and now alive. It would be an encouragement to the Smyrna church for what they were facing. But there's this observation that I saw. One thing about Smyrna is that the engineers, and I say that loosely, the builders of Smyrna forgot to put in any type of drain system. And so everything just kind of flowed in the streets and it smelled. And so it was great that they had this fragrance of myrrh to oversee that. And then I thought that in the midst of that wicked, pagan worshiping people was another group of people, this Smyrna church, who were being crushed, and out of that crushing was coming an incredible fragrance that was being lifted up to the Lord, and even actually making the world in which they lived better. They were destroyed, but they were rebuilt, and no matter what would happen to the church, even though they would be crushed, God was going to see to it. Jesus was going to see to it that it would survive. It would go on. One of the things that Jesus describes to them, and each one of these churches he says, I know this, I know this, I know this, I know this, which is a good thing for us because he knows. He knows where you are and what you're going through at this very moment. He knows. He knew what was going on in this little church there in Smyrna. He knew what was happening to those people. And he says, I know your afflictions. In fact, Leanna, if we can go back to the verses, I'd like to read these verses so that, again, we could have this in our mind. To the angel, messenger, Anglios, that's probably the pastor. To the pastor, to the angel of the church at Smyrna, write, these are the words of him who was first and last, who died and came back to life. Something that the church would have picked up on. I know your afflictions and your poverty. And then Jesus says, but you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Instead of praising God, they're really interfering with God. Don't be afraid about what you're about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. It's probably a figure of speech of time. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I'll give you life as a victory crown. I will give you life as a victor's crown. Whoever hears, let him hear. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And to the one who is victorious, he will not, or they will not be hurt by the second death. The word that at the beginning it says, I know your afflictions. It's an interesting word in the language. This is what they would do. They would lay somebody down and they would put weights on their chest. And then they keep adding weights and keep adding weights and keep adding weights until it eventually would crush them. And that's the imagery that Jesus is using. I know how you are being crushed. I know how you're being crushed. I know what you are going through. And then he says, and I know that you're poor, but you're rich. And we just want to pause there and say, you know we're poor, but we're rich? How can we be poor and rich? You know, how can that happen? But see, Jesus knew what they had. You may not have had something on the outside, but you got something that's on the inside. And if you fast forward to Revelation chapter 3, you'll hear of another church. In this other church, this is what the Laodicean church said. I am rich, I have acquired wealth, and I do not need a thing. That's what that church said. They would not have said, as Peter and John said, silver and gold have I not. They would have said, silver and gold have we. But this is what Jesus said. But you don't realize that you are wretched, poor, pitiful, blind, and naked. They thought they were rich, but they were poor. The church in Smyrna was rich. Their difficulty came in 3 waves. First of all, it was poverty. And I think we understand poverty a little bit different than perhaps it was taking place here. It wasn't that these people wouldn't work and didn't work, they did. But they lived in an arena, in an atmosphere, and in a setting that if you didn't go along with what was happening, you were cut out. Even if you tried to establish maybe a little business, you would be disenfranchised. People would not buy from you. And that was what's causing their poverty. They were isolated because of their testimony for Christ. They weren't just poor because of the fact of the environment. In fact, the city had money. And they could have had money. But because of what was going on, they were being cast aside, and because they were cast aside, they lost. There have been occasions when I have dealt with individuals who, because of their stand for Christ, lost a position or never got a position. There's a law officer in our city that probably should have been in a higher rank than what he was in. But because he was so strong in his commitment to Christ that they never allowed him to go any higher. That happens. That's not only happened here, it's happened in other places. That you take a stand for Jesus and it can eliminate you because they just feel like, well, you're just really not in touch with what's going on in the world. The Jews distanced themselves from the church and from Christians, and then actually help facilitate their poverty. They were poor because they were pushed aside. They were poor because they were trusting in Jesus. That's where their poverty came from. We can't relate to that, but that's what was going on. At least for the most part, we can't. They were disconnected and they were not able to function because of the limitations that were placed upon them. And then the Jews were slandering them. Several of the things that they said. One was the fact that they said the Jews, because of the way they took communion, When we take communion, we feel that it represents the body and blood of Christ, who was sacrificed for us and who was beaten for us. And they said that the Jews said that the Christians were cannibalistic. And so therefore they were telling Rome, these people are cannibals. And then they were telling Rome that they call everybody brother and sister, and they are anti-family. And so anything that the church was doing that was really commendable, the Jews were using it against them and slandering them and putting them in a place where, again, they would be further isolated. And then perhaps the worst of it all, they were put in prison. And this is, a tragedy. Right now, in our world, right now, there are tens of thousands of people are in prison because of their faith. We can hardly imagine it, but that's in our world right now. Tens of thousands of people who are in prison, suffering, simply because they're believing in Jesus. You cannot probably read, well, you can't go a week. You probably can go more than just a couple days. I refer often to the Christian Post. And without fail, I see so often somebody was killed, church was destroyed, leadership was martyred on a regular basis. That is happening in the world in which we live. Now, pressure's coming our way. To whatever degree we will see. But as we think about this, church, we realize that God is ultimately in control. And that's what Smyrna believed. They knew their destiny was different. For them, they knew that there was a long journey. And as they looked at their lives, this was just this time right now. What we are going through is ultimately temporary, and we know that in the end it's going to be different. And as you look at that, take any trial that you've gone through. I mean, some of the toughest trials of your life, and you will look at that and you will say, man, that was a horrible time or a difficult time. And yet, when you see it way in the measure of more time, you'll see how God was working before and after, and even during that time, you see that God was there working on your behalf. And then ultimately what was going to happen, or what is going to happen. You've made the right choice. You've accepted the grace of God. And we say, God, continue to give us that grace. Continue to give us that grace. There was no church that was suffering more than this church. And while it was the crown of Asia Minor, Jesus says, I'm going to give you your own crown. They would have never gotten one from Rome. They would have never gotten one for their city. They would not even be recognized. They were rejected. They were not included. They couldn't even participate. And it would look like for them, game over. But that's not the way it would be. It wasn't game over for them. In their hearts, they say, it's game on. We're going to live for God regardless. You can almost hear these Samaritans saying, we will not bow. We will not bow. They know God was preparing them for something special. They took a stand. And it's a witness to us today. Now, I want you to hear me out for the next 60 seconds. Because I want you to know what's happening right now. I think you hear it, I think you see it, but I want you to understand it. There is an agenda. There is an agenda. And the agenda that we're facing right now is that in our own society, in our own nation, we are being pressured not just to acknowledge an alternate lifestyle or even accept an alternate lifestyle, but this is where they are, and this is where they're headed. And don't think for a moment that this isn't happening. Don't think for a moment that it isn't happening. Because they're not just interested in you saying, yeah, well, we let everybody do what they want. People can do whatever they want to do. And we accept the fact that there are people that live like that. That's not enough. That's not enough. First of all, they want us to approve their lifestyle. They want us to approve their lifestyle. Then they want us to endorse their lifestyle. Then they want us to promote their lifestyle. Then they want us to support their lifestyle. And finally, the agenda that they have for you and I and for believers is to celebrate their lifestyle. And they will not be done until those things happen. And you could say, oh, not me. I'm not going to say anything. And you know what they'll say to you? They'll use that phrase we heard a summer or two ago. Silence is what? Violence. Silence is violence. This is where we're heading. And when the individual who holds the highest office in our nation will bring in somebody and celebrate it like it is natural and normal, should scream at us that this is where we are. We're not headed there. We're there. We're there. And we just need to know what we are up against. And it's going to get pressed and pressed and pressed and pressed upon us. And so what do we say? God, help us to stand. Help us to stand. Because we know, and we have, our hearts are broken because we know what sin does to people. It cripples them. It alienates them from others ultimately. And worst of all, it sends them to a Christless eternity. God is not honored, and they're lost forever. We care. We care. And so, church, as we look at this today, we need to say, God, help us to respond in a way that is glorifying to you in this, realizing that there will be those that will not understand until we celebrate it. We cannot bow, and we will not bow, because we only bow to God. And this church was facing situations that was demanding them to worship the God of Rome, which was Caesar. And they said, we will not do that. We cannot do that. And as those 3 Hebrew children, those boys, those young men said, we will not bow, they would not bow. There were a lot of martyrs that came out of the Smyrna church. Those of you who have studied any church history at all, and maybe have heard of a man named Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John and lived during part of John the Apostle's life. He pastored the church at Smyrna. There's writings that you can find of Polycarp. He wrote a letter to the Ephesus church. He distributed scriptures wherever he could. He did what he could to fight the error that was coming against the church. Really, he was probably one of the greatest heroes of the Smyrna church. One night, in his old age, he was 86 at the time, He had a dream of his pillow catching on fire. And he told his friends the next day, he said, I think God was warning me that I'm going to be burned at the stake for what I believe. The proconsul in the area ordered for him to be arrested, and they sent them to get Polycarp. When they came, he welcomed them and asked that if they would stay for a meal so that he could pray. So they stayed for about an hour, and he prayed while they were eating. And those that there said, according to the report, that how can we put this man to death? How can we do this? But they, doing what they were supposed to do, they arrested him and brought him. And when he faced the leader, he said, you're an old man. Why would you want to be put to death? And just renounce and say Caesar is Lord and we can let you go. And Polycarp said this statement that he is known for. I have served my master for 86 years. How can I now deny his name? And the proconsul said, we're going to throw you to the lions, to the wild beast. He said, you can do what you wish. I will not deny Jesus. So they stacked up wood to burn Polycarp to death. Normally they would nail those so they wouldn't move. Polycarp said, there's no need to nail me. Just loosely tie my hands. I will not move. They lit the fire, and then somebody reached in and stabbed him, and then he died, just as Christ said that there would be some who would do that. But he said, how can I deny the one in whom I have served this whole time? There are people in our world facing that. Most of us in this room will probably not see that to that degree, maybe in America. But we are facing things now that I never thought we would face. I have seen things I thought I would never see in my lifetime. But the church must be the church. And we must say, God, as we are being crushed, may there be an aroma and a fragrance coming from our life that will be a blessing to those around. And may it make us stronger. And whatever it is that we may be facing. Because sometimes right now we may not be dealing with persecution from a job. But there could be things that are crushing your life. Things that you wonder, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And we say, God, help me. Help me. And I want you to know, church, he will.